DFS has many, many applications. And we will see a couple of applications in this course, but beyond this, you will find that it's used all over the place. But in order to use DFS well, you need to understand some of the properties of DFS. So let's go over the basic ones right now. So we described the DFS algorithm in the last segment, and we also showed you how it worked on a particular graph. And recall that the way it worked was all vertices were initially white. We start somewhere, color it gray, and then we divide vertices into the unseen ones, which are colored white, the visited but not finished ones, which are colored gray, and the finished ones, which are colored black. And at every step, some vertex changed color. Now, we could actually keep track of the step number at which all these things happen, the color changes of vertices. So imagine a counter, which counts the steps. Let's call that counter time, just for convenience. And let's say that this counter advances each time a vertex is visited or finished. And let's see what would happen in the previous example to this counter. So you notice that immediately that for every vertex v, there's a time s of v at which it's first visited. That's the start time when the vertex comes alive or is active, if you like. And there's a time f of v for finish time when it's finished, when it's colored black, after which we will never see this vertex again. So a vertex is active between s of v and f of v. So let's understand how these times are related. So if you look at this graph that we have here, and the DFS tree is shown on the left. So I haven't shown the graph here, but it's the same graph as in the last segment. And here's the DFS tree for it on the left. Then if you go back to how we showed DFS working on that graph, you will find that the node 3 starts at step 1, because we immediately, as soon as we began the DFS, we colored 3 gray. That's when the starting time of node 3. So S of 3 is 1. And of course, it's the last to finish. So because when we finish with 3, DFS as a whole is finished. So 3 is alive for the entire duration, from 1 to 14. Now, immediately from 3, we went to node 6. And so 6 is discovered at step 2. And just before 3 was finished, 6 was finished at the previous step. So if you go back and look at it, you can see that 6 is alive for the duration 2 to 13. And then the rest, so then we recall that we went from 6 to 2, but then we had to finish with 2 before we went to the other neighbor of 6, 1. And that's why the picture here shows that 2 is alive for one part of the duration of 6, and then there's a one step gap, and then 1 is alive for the other part. Okay, so this is the structure of the durations that different nodes are alive in the DFS that we did for that graph. So theorem here is that if U is a descendant of V in the DFS tree, and we need to explain the term descendant and ancestor in a tree, which are used quite commonly, and they have the same meanings as they do in the English language, meaning that a node U is a descendant of a node V if you can go from V to one of its children, and from there to another of its children, and so on. Keep going down through one of the children until you get to U. Basically, in the tree, V lies on the path from the root to U. That's when V is an ancestor and U is a descendant. So V is an ancestor of U, meaning that it looks like, the picture looks like this. The root is somewhere here. So that's the root. And then V is down here and U is below V. Then we say that U is a descendant of V and V is an ancestor of U. So this is very much like the way we use these words in the English language. One subtle difference in the mathematical use of these words is that we consider a node to be an ancestor of itself as well as a descendant of itself. So V is a descendant of V, and V is an ancestor of V. Other than that, it's exactly the same. Okay, so the theorem says that if U is a descendant of V in the DFS tree, for example, 5 is a descendant of 6. Okay, so that's an example of a relationship like that. Then The duration that 5 is active is a subset of the duration that 6 is active. So you can see that in the picture on the right, that 5 is active from time step 4 to time step 7, and 6 is active from time step 2 to time step 13. So definitely the duration that 5 is active is a subset of the duration that 6 is active. So this is a nice nesting property of the active durations of different vertices. They all nest within each other, or they're completely disjoint from each other. So, for example, the duration that 2 is active is completely disjoint from the duration that 1 is active. So for any two vertices, either their durations of being active are completely disjoint from each other, or they're nested within each other. This is a property of DFS. Another important property is the following. DFS is depth-first search, meaning it will not fail to discover a vertex that can be discovered. It will not finish with some vertex V if there's a vertex U that could have been discovered from V. So that's what this theorem says. If DFS is at vertex V, and there is a path consisting entirely of unseen vertices from V to some vertex U, then U will be discovered and finished before DFS finishes at V. In other words, U will become a descendant of V in the DFS tree. So here is again a rough idea of the proof. Again, we are not doing very rigorous proofs very often in this course, but a full-fledged algorithms course would actually cover these things very carefully and prove these things very carefully. We will use a proof technique called proof by contradiction, which we've seen before. But let me just try to tell you what proof by contradiction is. So we want to prove some statement A. And in a proof by contradiction, we start by assuming that A is false. And then we logically derive something that's impossible to be true, so something that's absurd. When we derive something absurd, we know that our initial assumption that A is false must be wrong, and therefore we've proved that A is true. So this is the general structure of a proof by contradiction. So suppose for contradiction that we are doing DFS of some vertex V. So again, so there is a path from V to U of entirely undiscovered vertices along the way, and we still fail to discover U before we finish at V. Could this happen? Let's assume that this could happen for the sake of contradiction. Let W be the first vertex, unseen vertex on the path from V to U that we did not see before we finished at V. So let W be a vertex on the path from V to U. And suppose W is the first vertex that we did not discover before we finished at V, beg your pardon. So why did we not discover W? Well, the vertex just preceding W on the path from V to U might be a vertex called X. And we did discover X. Well, we did discover X because we are assuming that W was the first vertex on this path that we did not discover before finishing at V. Well, when we discovered X, how could we have finished at X before discovering W, which is the neighbor of X? We couldn't. So that's an absurdity. So there could not be any W that we did not discover before finishing at V, and therefore we must have discovered, so there could not be such a W, then we must have discovered U as well before finishing at V. That's the proof that U would be discovered before finishing at V. All right, so those are some properties of DFS. We may need others later on, but for now, let's work with these properties and see how DFS might be applied. How do we discover, for example, the connected components of a graph? Remember that connected components are maximal subgraphs that for every pair of vertices in the subgraph, there's a path from one to the other. If you're a human being and you're given a graph, telling the connected components is really, really easy because they're just the pieces of the graph that are drawn as little islands that don't have any connections with each other. So for a human, again, to eye a graph and tell the connected components is easy. But if you imagine a graph with millions of vertices that has not been drawn in such a friendly way, maybe the the vertices of different connected components are interleaved with each other, and there's a mess of edges, then even for humans, this may be difficult to tell what the connected components are. For example, if you look at the Facebook graph of friends, is every vertex connected to every vertex? That's a question. Probably the answer is yes. But if you're given that graph with the millions of users and the edges joining users, in fact, probably billions of users, and the edges joining users that are friends, can you quickly identify the connected components? Doesn't seem so easy anymore. So we need an algorithm for this, and DFS is a good algorithm for finding the connected components of a graph. So what we do is we sort of wrap DFS, around DFS we put something called DFS visit. So we have DFS of G, and within it we make a function called DFS visit. The idea is the following. So initially you're given a graph G which may or may not be connected, which may or may not have more than one component. Each vertex is white. We start at some white vertex U and call DFS visit of G at the vertex U. And that just follows the algorithm that we saw in the last few slides. And what are all the vertices that will be colored black at the end of the DFS visit of U? Exactly those vertices that are in the connected component of U. So when DFS visit returns from the call at U, it would have marked as black all the vertices that are in the same connected component of U. So that's one connected component we've found. Now we look at in the outer DFS, we are looking for any vertex remaining that's still colored white. If there is such a vertex, then we know there's a second component, or at least a second component, because when we did the DFS visit at U, we did not reach this vertex. Let's call it W. So then we do DFS visit at W, and again, that will color black all the vertices in W's connected component, and that's the second connected component we found. We again, in the wrapper DFS of G, we look to see if there's any other white vertex, and we keep going until there are no white vertices left. So at the end, we've at least counted the number of connected components. A small bookkeeping modification of this algorithm allows you not just to count the number of connected components, but also output the vertices in each connected component separately. That's one obvious and necessary application of DFS, because very often we want to know if a graph is connected, and we use DFS for that. The next thing you might want to know, a basic property of a graph, is telling if a graph is acyclic. And I'm talking still about undirected graphs. And for undirected graphs, it's particularly easy. Telling if a graph is acyclic is just the same as asking if there are any back edges at all. Anytime there's a back edge from U to V, we know there must be a path of tree edges from V to U. Back edges go from descendants to ancestors only. So there's a path of tree edges from the ancestor to the descendant, and the back edge from the descendant to the ancestor. Together that makes a cycle. So anytime there's a back edge, we basically know that the graph has a cycle. So all we have to do to discover if the graph is cyclic is, when we are doing DFS at a gray vertex, if we ever encounter an edge to another gray vertex, we can conclude that the graph has a cycle. And that's a correct test. So now let's turn to DFS on directed graphs. On the left-hand side, we have a directed graph with 8 vertices. And we're going to start our DFS at node D. And the resulting structure is shown on the right-hand side. Now, things are a lot more complicated than for undirected graphs. A DFS on a directed graph can actually produce 4 types of edges, because there are directions. We'll see how. So from D, the DFS first discovers the vertex C. That's one of the neighbors. It's arbitrary how it discovered C. So it discovered C, and then from C, it could have discovered a couple of different vertices, but let's say it discovers B first. And from B, it has to discover F. At F, there's an edge from F to C, but notice that C is already gray. We've been there, so we visited it. So this edge from F to C is a back edge, and so it's indicated as a blue edge in this picture. So there are back edges. But of course, a DFS does not take a back edge. It just notices the back edge. But now DFS at F is finished because there are no other neighbors to discover from F. Note that from F we cannot go to G because the edge is pointing in the wrong direction. The edge is pointing from G to F. So you cannot go from F to G. So DFS at F is finished. We backtrack. We go to B, and DFS at B is also finished because the only edge we could have gone to is F, and we've already done that. So we backtrack all the way to C. At C, we discover the vertex G because there is an edge from C to G. So that's another child of C. Now, when we are at G, we notice the edge from G to F. Now, F is not even just gray, it's actually black. F is finished. So this is something called the cross edge. It doesn't go between descendants and ancestors, but it goes across the tree. Always from the right to the left. It never goes from the left to the right. So cross edges are these red edges that go across the tree between from right to left. It's from G to F, for example. And the example continues. One other type of edge I want to highlight is after we have finished with G, we wrap up and we come back to C, and we are finished at C, and we come to D. And now we notice the edge DG. Again, we don't take it because G is by now finished. So G is black. So we don't take an edge to any node unless it's white. So G is finished and it's black. So DG is a different kind of edge called a forward edge. This would not arise in an undirected graph because then it would be GD would be a back edge. But here, DG is a forward edge. So a DFS on a directed graph can produce four types of edges: tree edges that are shown in black here, back edges that are shown in blue here, forward edges that are green, and cross edges that are red.